The city of silent bells, where 47 nuns disappeared overnight. Convent on the hill. You arrive in the small Italian city of Rocca del Fiume. It's not listed in many guidebooks. You won't find tourist buses rolling through its narrow alleys. There are no bustling cafes or Instagrammable piazzas. Just ancient cobblestone streets, cracked sandstone walls, and air heavy with the scent of moss and memory. High above the town, perched like a forgotten crown, stands a weather-worn building, with tall arched windows and a roof darkened by centuries of storms. This is Santa Bellina del Carmelo, once a thriving convent, now mostly empty stone. No voices, no candles, and most notably no bells. The bell tower, tall and pointed like a steepled finger, has remained silent for 150 years. No one in the city remembers hearing them. It wasn't always so. According to church records, Santa Bellina housed a thriving community of 48 nuns, many of whom had taken their vows during times of political upheaval in Italy. The convent offered them shelter, spiritual focus, and a simple life away from the growing industrial noise of the outside world. They made herbal tinctures, grew lavender, and copied scripture by hand. The rhythm of bells marked everything: prayer, meals, silence, until one night in 1883, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the bells rang without warning. It was not the usual melody used for early prayer. Instead, it was a frenzied, uneven clanging three. Long tolls, followed by a chaotic sequence of rings that echoed all the way down to the lower town. And then silence. A few townspeople, mostly millers and bakers rising for their morning routines, looked up and saw faint lights in the convent windows. But no one investigated, not then. It wasn't until midday that the town's parish priest, Father Giancarlo, made the steep walk up the hill. What he found was strange, but not violent. The convent door was unlocked, swaying slightly in the wind. The garden gate was open. Pots still boiled in the kitchen. Ink was fresh on a half-written psalm. Beds were made. Sandals were lined up neatly at the foot of each bunk. But there was no one inside. No blood. No struggle. No sign of where 47 women had gone. Only Sister Celestina, the eldest nun and too frail to walk without help, remained. She was found kneeling in the sanctuary, staring at the altar. When questioned, she did not speak. She never did again. Father Giancarlo's initial report was brief. He noted the missing nuns, confirmed that the doors were intact, and requested the involvement of the local bishop. Days later, a more formal inquiry began. Civil officials, clergy, and even a few from Rome came to examine the site. Theories bloomed. Some whispered of mass suicide. Others suggested a secret tunnel under the convent, though none was ever found. A few believed the nuns had joined a nearby revolutionary group in disguise, but there was no evidence to support any of it. No notes, no sightings, no confessions. The bells never rang again. In time, people stopped talking about it. The city chose to forget. The convent was closed permanently in 1890. The remaining Sister Celestina was transferred to a hospital in Florence, where she died a year later without ever uttering a word. But some records, those that survived fires, mold, and bureaucratic neglect, paint a slightly stranger picture. In a ledger found in 1921, tucked inside the church's archive, was a curious entry in Father Giancarlo's handwriting. It read, "The bells did not ring by hand." He had gone up the tower himself, he noted, and found the rope coiled neatly, untouched. The bells, massive iron relics cast in the 17th century, could not ring themselves. They had no mechanism, no wind chime structure, and no electric system, which did not yet exist. They required force human hands pulling the rope in rhythm. So who rang the bells that night? And if no one did, why did 47 women vanish immediately after? The Vatican eventually sealed the investigation as inconclusive. The convent was deconsecrated and eventually sold to a private buyer. Today, it stands as a forgotten shadow above Rocca del Fiume. Most residents won't talk about it. Children are told not to go near. And every year on the same date, March 17th, the bells are said to be heard faintly, even though the ropes were removed long ago. It's only a story now, passed from old tongues to younger ears, but the building still stands. The walls still echo, and the bells, even in their silence, still ask the question the world could never answer. Where did the Sisters of Santa Bellina go that night? The investigation that never really began. Rocca del Fiume was not a city used to mystery. It was a place of routines, markets on Tuesdays, sermons on Sundays, and quiet meals with stale bread and olive oil in between. But after the disappearance at Santa Bellina del Carmelo, the rhythm of the town faltered. For the first few weeks after the incident, the convent was not declared a crime scene. It was treated, curiously, more like a haunted house. The locals referred to it as Il Silenzio, the silence. Some even began walking alternate routes through the town, just to avoid glimpsing the bell tower's jagged silhouette against the sky. Even the clergy, typically the ones to offer reassurance in times of unease, seemed unsure of what to say. There were no funerals. There were no names read aloud. Just absence. The formal inquiry, when it came, was more for appearance than answers. Led by Bishop Anselmo of Florence, accompanied by 2 monks and a scribe, the Vatican's delegation arrived 18 days after the bells rang. By then, the building had settled back into stillness. Dust had returned. Candles had burned out. The scent of lavender, once so dominant in the convent's halls, had faded to the faintest trace. They began, of course, by speaking to Sister Celestina. She had been transferred to the parish house in the lower town, where she was confined to a single room with a window facing away from the convent. Attempts to speak with her were brief and frustrating. She did not appear mentally disturbed. She ate when fed, blinked when spoken to, but she responded to no one. Not the bishop, not the monks, not even Father Giancarlo, who had known her for over 30 years. The only words she ever muttered, and only once, were heard late at night by the housekeeper. Non siamo mai stati qui. We were never here. Some dismissed it as the babble of an old woman broken by shock. Others, especially the housekeeper, a superstitious widow named Louisa, believed it meant something far darker. That perhaps whatever had happened inside that convent had changed something deeper than memory. The search of the convent grounds turned up nothing substantial. No signs of mass burial. No evidence of escape tunnels beneath the chapel, though some theorized there may have been older structures below the foundation that were never documented. A small stone room beneath the altar was discovered, but it contained nothing but an iron candlestick and several crumbling books of prayer. The convent's official ledgers, however, revealed something odd. The daily register maintained by the convent secretary had entries up until the day before the disappearance. The final line, dated March 16th, reads simply, "Preparations complete. Tomorrow begins the silence." No further context. No mention of any event, guest, or ceremony. Just those 6 words, what preparations, and what silence? Was it symbolic or literal? The investigators noted the cryptic message and moved on. But it would remain the last entry ever made in the convent's books. The bells were examined next, tall, tarnished, and suspended high in the tower. They had not rung since that March morning. The rope, as noted by Father Giancarlo, was found neatly coiled. There were no signs of tampering, no footprints in the dust, no birds nesting in the tower. The bells, when tapped lightly by the bishop's assistant, still produced a deep, resonant tone that could be heard down the hill. Asterisk, but no one dared ring them properly. Not even once. Asterisk in the local archives, city records revealed something long buried. The land on which the convent was built had once belonged to a pagan temple Roman. According to some, though others believed it went back even further, local. Legend told of women's voices echoing from the cliffs at night, of rituals that required silence, absolute and eternal. Most of these tales were dismissed as folklore, passed through too many mouths to be reliable. But still, they lingered in the back of every mind involved in the investigation. Asterisk. Then there was the matter of the 48th nun. Asterisk, you might recall that the convent housed 48 women. Yet on that fateful morning, only 47 were missing. Asterisk, one body was never accounted for. Sister Evelina, a novice who had only arrived at Santa Bellina 3 weeks before the incident. She had no family name listed in the registry, no origin parish, no baptismal certificate, and no mention in any correspondence except a single letter addressed to the Mother Superior. Written in elegant but unfamiliar Latin. Asterisk, the letter read, "Do not fear what walks with silence. She is not of the world, but of the vow." No signature, no explanation. Asterisk, who was Sister Evelina? Why was she not among the missing? Why was she never mentioned again by anyone, not even Sister Celestina? When the inquiry ended, Bishop Anselmo submitted a carefully worded report to Rome. It concluded that no natural explanation could account for the disappearance, and that further investigation is not recommended. Within a year, the convent was sold to a retired merchant who planned to renovate it into a vineyard. The workmen lasted less than 2 weeks. Tools went missing, stones fell. One man fell ill and claimed he heard whispers at night, Latin prayers spoken backward. The project was abandoned, and the building was left to rot once more. Asterisk. Today, if you walk the road up to the ruins, you might see the bell tower still standing like a ghost against the sky. Locals say the bells no longer ring, not by hand, not by wind. But once, someone claimed to have recorded a faint sound at dawn on March 17th, a rhythmic chime that matched the pattern described in 1883. Asterisk, and once again, the question arises, was it the bells that signaled the nuns' disappearance? Or the sound that made it possible? The final sound. If you were to return to Rocca del Fiume today, you might not even notice Santa Bellina at first glance. The hillside is overgrown. The stone path is cracked, half buried beneath wild thyme and curled ivy leaves. No official plaques mark the convent's location. No memorial stands in the town square. Asterisk, but if you ask softly, and to the right person, they'll point to the path and say, "Don't go up there alone, especially not in March." Asterisk, there's no police report, no signed confession, no physical evidence that proves anything extraordinary happened that night in 1883. And yet, the legend persists. Not because of the spectacle, but because of the silence. Because 47 women disappeared, and no one ever heard a scream. Asterisk, a year after the event, the only survivor, Sister Celestina, was buried in Florence. Her grave marker reads simply, "Faithful until the end." But what was the end? And was she the only survivor, or just the one left behind? Asterisk, for decades, the story faded. It wasn't until the 1930s, when a Jesuit scholar named Lorenzo de' Monti began researching silent convents across Europe, that Santa Bellina's mystery re-emerged. Monti believed there were patterns, other convents, monasteries, or hermitages, where groups of religious figures vanished under strange circumstances. He found scattered records, a Franciscan priory in Belgium where all 12 monks were found asleep and unresponsive, their eyes open and unblinking. A Cistercian abbey in rural Spain where 15 nuns walked into the forest and were never seen again. Asterisk, Santa Bellina, however, remained the most complete case. Monty's most compelling finding came from a local farmer's journal. The farmer, Benedetto Lotti, had worked land near the convent in 1883. In a private entry dated the day after the disappearance, he wrote, "There was a sound. Not of bells, not quite. It was like metal, but slow. A kind of humming. I felt it in my chest before I heard it in my ears." The journal wasn't submitted during the inquiry. Benedetto had never spoken publicly about it, fearing ridicule. Or worse, but the description matches other accounts. Monty had collected low-frequency tones, described as resonant, inhuman, and in some cases, harmonic. Monty theorized that these convents may have been exposed to sound phenomena not yet understood by science. Some connection between structure, stone, and resonance. He even worked with acousticians to test the bell tower at Santa Bellina, *. When they reassembled a bell in 1941, something unusual happened. The tone it emitted deep and ancient, produced standing vibrations in the air that were not immediately audible but made audio instruments spike. The wave lingered for a full 11 seconds after the bell was silenced. And nearby birds stopped singing. What was this sound? And more importantly, had it happened before? That same year, World War II began to touch Italy's borders. The convent, still abandoned, was briefly occupied by soldiers from the local militia who needed shelter. 3 weeks later, they were gone. No trace, no message. The site was never investigated due to the chaos of the war. And so, the building was declared cursed. Not officially, but in every practical sense. People began to refer to it not as Santa Bellina, but simply La Torre Mutata, the Tower of the Muted. Modern science tried to explain the phenomenon. Some suggested it was infrasound frequencies below the range of human hearing that can induce feelings of dread, nausea, even hallucinations. Others claimed the stones used in the convent's construction had a piezoelectric effect, meaning that under pressure, they could emit strange signals. But that doesn't explain how 47 people disappeared without footprints, without signs of exit, and without returning. Even the Vatican's secret archives, made partially accessible in the late 1990s, contained references to Santa Bellina. One file simply read, "Event unsolvable," marked as a vox. A vox, in Old Ecclesiastical Latin, translates roughly to "without voice." Today, the convent remains uninhabited. A steel gate was erected at the trailhead in 2009 after a group of urban explorers went missing for 3 days. When they reappeared, disoriented and filthy, they claimed they had only just entered. None of their footage survived. Their camera was intact, but the SD card was melted. So what happened to the 47 nuns of Santa Bellina? Did they walk willingly into some sacred silence? Were they taken by something, or called away? Or was it a convergence of architecture, ritual, and sound, a human-made resonance chamber that erased time, identity, and voice? All we know is this: the bells never rang by hand, the doors were never locked, and silence came not as an absence, but as a presence. Even now, on March 17th, a few believe they can hear it, faint, rhythmic, like a bell's final breath, but no one listens long. The diary that shouldn't have been found. You are in the town of Weingarten, tucked deep in the Black Forest of southwestern Germany. It's quiet here. Too quiet, many would say. The town, with its crooked timber houses and mist-covered fields, seems like the kind of place where time takes long naps. The forest rises on all sides like a wall of deep green, and when the wind passes through the pine branches, it sounds like distant voices whispering in a language no one speaks anymore. At the edge of town stands the remains of Kloster Heiligenfeld, a once proud Benedictine convent that was partially destroyed by fire in 1922. Most people who pass it today see only a blackened archway, a crumbling stone wall, and an overgrown graveyard filled with nameless markers. But what you wouldn't see, what wasn't supposed to survive, is the small, leather-bound diary that was pulled from the ashes during cleanup. The man who found it was a laborer named Klaus Brenner, hired to clear debris from the north wing of the burned structure. He wasn't educated, nor particularly religious, but he had a habit of collecting odd things. He noticed the book tucked beneath a half-collapsed cabinet, nearly fused to the floor. Miraculously, the interior pages were untouched, preserved in a strange pocket of dryness, despite the surrounding ash. The diary belonged to a nun named Sister Johanna Albrecht, who had lived at the convent for over 30 years. There were no dramatic entries, no tales of torment or miracles, only brief, quiet observations about daily routines, scripture readings, herbal tinctures, and something else. Starting in October of 1921, the tone of the entries began to shift. She began writing phrases like, "The voices under the chapel are louder at night. I fear the bell rope is not what it seems. We are not alone when we kneel." Most dismissed it as religious fervor or the mental decline of an aging woman. But the entries continued day after day with increasingly specific references to the one behind the altar. When Klaus brought the diary to the local clergy, it was quietly taken from him. He was told not to speak of it again. But not before he had copied a few of the most disturbing pages into his own notebook. Among them, "Today I saw Sister Agnes walking the courtyard at dawn. She died last spring. I am not mistaken. The chapel door opened before matins. No one was inside. No one could have opened it. The candle near the sanctuary flickers backwards." Soon after the diary was taken, it was destroyed, burned, on the orders of the abbot. Officially, the reason given was to prevent spiritual confusion. But the real reason became clear later. You see, the fire that destroyed the convent happened exactly 1 week after the diary was burned. The blaze began in the chapel, at the base of the altar, sometime after midnight. No cause was ever determined. No candles were lit. No lightning struck. The building was mostly empty. Only 5 sisters remained after years of dwindling numbers. None survived. Their bodies were found curled in prayer, their faces serene. No struggle. No signs of fear. But on one of the charred beams near the altar, someone found a handprint. It wasn't made of soot or ash. It was made of something oily, something that stained the wood and resisted washing. It had too many fingers. Officially, the event was marked down as an electrical accident. The convent was never rebuilt. The surrounding land was sold to private owners, and slowly, the ruins were swallowed by the forest. As for Klaus Brenner, he left town a year later. Before he vanished, he told a neighbor something strange. They didn't burn the book, not really. They just gave it back to whoever was waiting for it. Was Sister Johanna mad? Were her writings the ramblings of an aging mind? Or warnings no one took seriously? And if the diary truly was calling out, what was it calling to? And most haunting of all, if something was under the chapel, what happened when the fire set it free? The fire that did not burn everything, the official report from the Weingarten Fire Brigade, is stored in a box in the town's civil archive. Faded and fragile, its pages smell of mold and time. The handwriting is neat and restrained, though the tone betrays discomfort beneath the professionalism. There is no mention of Sister Johanna's diary, no mention of the handprint. Just a polite paragraph noting a fire of unknown origin, likely accelerated by dry timber and poor ventilation. What the report does not explain is why there was no damage to the floor beneath the altar. Everything else, beams, pews, even the stone lectern, was cracked, blackened, or crumbled. But the exact center of the fire's starting point remained, strangely untouched. a perfect square of stone beneath the altar slab. Clean, smooth, not even smoke-stained. No one had an explanation. The mayor at the time, Herr Otto Lenz, wrote a private letter to his cousin in Stuttgart a few days after the disaster. In it, he admitted that he had gone up to the ruins early, before the clergy or firefighters arrived. He wanted to see the place himself. He wrote, "There was a smell I did not recognize, like metal left too long in vinegar. The altar was whole, untouched, though the ceiling above it had collapsed. And beneath the slab something moved, not sawdust, not rats, something breathing. Slowly." This letter never made it into official accounts. It was found years later among Lenz's personal effects, after he died alone in a rest home, unable to speak. Let's return, for a moment, to the diary. Before it was taken and burned, Klaus Brenner made 5 copied pages, now preserved in the hands of a private collector in Freiburg. These pages remain controversial among historians not because of their content, but because of what came with them. One of the pages contains a symbol drawn carefully in the corner. It's not decorative, nor part of any religious art tradition. Resembling a spiral enclosed in a triangle, it matches a carving found beneath the chapel floor in 1923, when reconstruction was briefly considered. The carving was dismissed as decorative, though no record of it appears in earlier architectural plans. In the diary's final entry dated just 2 days before Sister Johanna's presumed death, she wrote, "We are still praying, but something else is listening. It does not sleep, it waits beneath. Sister Agnes keeps lighting the wrong candles. She says she hears singing behind the walls, even when no one is in the chapel. I asked her where she learned the tune. She said it was taught to her by someone who doesn't have a mouth." That phrase, "someone who doesn't have a mouth," appears twice more in different spots, often in Latin or written backward in mirror script. Klaus thought it might be a metaphor for silence, or perhaps an allusion to an old folktale. But others wonder if it points to something more literal, something ancient. When local masons arrived in 1923 to assess the feasibility of restoring the convent, they made a discovery that halted all plans: a sealed stairwell beneath the chapel, covered by the altar foundation. The stairs led nowhere, cut off after only a few steps. But the wall at the bottom was strange, marked with claw-like scrapes and embedded with smooth black stones that didn't match the geology of the region. The abbot who oversaw the site at the time requested that the stairwell be resealed. He later relocated to Rome and refused to speak about the convent again. A year after his death in 1948, a Vatican archivist confirmed that he had filed a document classified under involuntary ritual sites. That phrase, involuntary ritual sites, is used only in reference to places where rituals occurred without human intent, as if something else used the participants, or the place itself, to achieve a purpose. Which brings us back to the diary. Sister Johanna, as it turns out, was not the first to write one. In 1886, a priest named Father Tobias Meisner filed a report after visiting the convent during a routine pilgrimage. He noted that a previous nun, Sister Ermina, had been found wandering the woods barefoot and silent, carrying the black book she refused to relinquish. She died days later of exposure, clutching the book to her chest. That book, too, was destroyed. Twice now, books have surfaced from Kloster Heiligenfeld, both times followed by fire. So what were these diaries recording? Were they just the confessions of lonely women isolated in their faith? Or were they attempts to document a growing awareness that something beneath the chapel, perhaps long buried or forgotten, was beginning to make itself known? And if the diary was destroyed in fire, why did the smell of its pages still linger in the town library 10 years later, according to an anonymous librarian's letter to the archdiocese? Why, even today, do some visitors say they hear quiet humming sounds in the wind when walking near the ruins? A pattern, slow and rhythmic, almost like prayer. Asterisk, and perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, what happens to a place of silence when something inside it finally starts to speak? The thing that listened. By 1956, few remembered the fire that consumed Kloster Heiligenfeld. The ruins had settled into silence, vines curling around the blackened stones like slow-moving hands. The townspeople of Weingarten had returned to their routines, harvesting pine resin, baking dark bread, and leaving the forest to itself. Asterisk, but every few years, something would stir. Asterisk, in the spring of that year, a student from Heidelberg University named Anke Vaz arrived in town. She was writing her thesis on psychospiritual records of female monastic life in pre-war Europe, a subject most found too dull to argue with. She was quiet, polite, and determined to explore what remained of the convent. With permission from the town council, she began to sift through what little documentation survived: the ledger pages, the restoration blueprints, the few charred objects that hadn't been destroyed. Asterisk, and then, one evening, Anke went up the hill alone. Asterisk, she was only gone for 3 hours. But when she returned, she looked pale and unfocused. She said little. She stayed one more night in the local inn and left early the next morning. She never submitted her thesis. She never returned to university. Asterisk, her professor, curious about her disappearance, wrote to her family and learned that she had taken up residence in a convent in the far north, in silence, under a different name. No one ever heard her speak again, but she left behind a single item, a journal of her own. Inside were only 7 pages, written in rapid, almost frantic German. The final entry is particularly disturbing. It reads, "I found the slab. I saw the marks beneath it. I did not lift it, but I felt what waited. It knew my name before I arrived. It knew I would come alone. The stones hum, they do not forget." And I understood finally why the nun burned her words. Because some prayers are not meant to be read by ears that still live. Anke's journal now sits, unread, in a private collection. Every institution it has been offered to has declined to publish its contents. Asterisk, but this wasn't the end of the story. Asterisk, in 1974, a group of forestry workers unearthed a sealed glass jar while clearing land along the border of the convent grounds. Inside was a bundle of withered herbs, a length of braided thread, and a small sheet of parchment with a spiral triangle symbol drawn in blood-red ink. On the back, the words, "To bind the mouth beneath. Do not disturb the rhythm." It was later discovered that similar jars had been found buried beneath each corner of the chapel's foundation, 4 in total. Each one broken, except this one. Asterisk, had the structure been a seal? A cage? And if so, who built it? Why a convent? Why nuns? Why women who had dedicated their lives to silence and prayer? Asterisk, one theory, published anonymously in 1981 in a fringe theology journal, suggested that Kloster Heiligenfeld was never meant to house the living, that it was erected on purpose, over something ancient, not evil, necessarily, but primordial, tied not to sin but to sound, something that listens endlessly and responds only to patterns of silence. Asterisk, this would explain the involuntary ritual site classification, filed decades earlier by the Vatican. It would also explain the unnatural behaviors described in the burned diary, the humming, the backward flickering candles, the sensation that something knelt alongside them during prayer, something that didn't blink or breathe. Asterisk, today, what remains of the convent is little more than a warped outline of its original form. The archways have collapsed. The staircase that once led to the chapel is overgrown. Only one slab remains untouched, the altar stone, uncracked, unburned, cold to the touch even in summer. Asterisk, and even now, a few visitors who come close claim they feel something stir beneath their feet. Not loud, not violent, but steady, like a breath being held. Like a listener waiting for a prayer that hasn't yet been spoken. So ask yourself this: if a diary holds truth, not in what it says, but in what it silences. If fire cannot destroy memory, if stone remembers rhythm, then what is still listening beneath the ash? The guest who is never logged. You are in the region of Occitanie, in southern France. The year is 1911. A bitter spring wind rolls through. The cypress trees, whistling through the broken shutters of the long-abandoned Couvent Sainte Marguerite, a convent once nestled among the lavender fields just outside the village of Méréville. From a distance, it still looks noble, its red clay roof tiles catching the sun, its arched windows resisting time. But step closer, and the cracks begin to show. The convent had been empty for decades, closed by the church in the late 1800s due to structural decay and regional instability. But those who lived in Méréville at the time remember a different reason. They remember Room 12. It was never officially called that. But among the sisters, Room 12 became synonymous with misfortune. Located at the far end of the second-floor hallway, it was small and unremarkable, a simple cot, a writing desk, and a view of the forest. But over the course of nearly 40 years, every sister who occupied it either died suddenly, vanished, or fell into complete mental deterioration. The church, reluctant to accept superstition within its own walls, dismissed these incidents as coincidence. They reassigned residents, repainted the walls, even blessed the room with sacred oil. But the pattern didn't break. Each time someone moved in, something eventually went wrong. And worse, the deaths were always unrecorded. One of the most troubling cases was that of Sister Amélie, a young postulant from Marseille who arrived in 1869. Bright, soft-spoken, and musically gifted, she was assigned to Room 12 due to space constraints. She spent her days practicing hymns and copying scripture, but her behavior changed after the third week. She began to sleepwalk, wandering the halls at night, humming a tune no one recognized. One evening, the Mother Superior followed her discreetly. She watched as Sister Amélie entered the chapel, stood before the altar, and began to chant in Latin, but the words didn't match any known prayer. They weren't even real Latin. They were inverted fragments, spoken backward. Like someone had taught her to say something without understanding it. The next morning, Sister Amélie was gone. Her sandals were still neatly placed beside her bed. The window had not been opened. There was no sign of a struggle. Just a folded piece of parchment on her pillow, with a single line written in spidery ink. I opened it. What she had opened, or how, was never known. The convent quietly recorded her transferred, though no such paperwork was ever processed. Her name never appeared again in church documents. This was not the first case, nor the last. Over the years, 11 other sisters who had stayed in Room 12 either went missing or died without explanation. In each case, the convent logged the incident as a routine departure. No family was ever notified. No burial records exist. And yet, during a brief renovation in 1909, workers found something strange beneath the floorboards of Room 12. An ossuary pit, lined with limestone and carefully sealed. Inside were 11 sets of human remains, each wearing fragments of worn cloth, consistent with a nun's habit. The bones were arranged in a circle. The church, once again, offered no comment. The renovation was halted. The floor was resealed. The convent was shuttered soon after. But even in its abandonment, whispers persisted. A shepherd claimed to hear chanting from the upper windows during foggy mornings. A pair of travelers, lost and seeking shelter, said they saw a woman in white peering out from the second story, though no one had lived there in years. And most curiously, in 1954, a local boy who dared enter the building on a bet swore he found Room 12 locked from the inside, despite all doors being open when he entered. When he forced it open, he saw only dust and a wooden cross hanging upside down. He left and never spoke of it again. So what happened in room 12? Were these the deaths of fragile minds, broken by solitude and silence? Or was there something else in that room, something older than the convent itself, drawn to repetition? Secrecy and devotion twisted into something darker? There are no answers in the archives. No names listed among the dead. But the bones remain. The room remains. And maybe so does whatever was waiting to be opened again. The ledger that was never meant to be read after the closure of Kuvang. St. Marguerite in 1911, most believe the chapter was closed. The local bishopric issued no statements. The nuns were quietly relocated to other parishes, and the church took deliberate steps to make the building disappear from public memory. But you can't erase silence, especially not the kind that echoes. In 1932, decades later, a young priest named Father Julian Mercier began research in unsanctioned monastic practices for his doctoral thesis. His interest in Kuvang St. Marguerite began with a single line found in a dusty ecclesiastical index: convent permanently vacated due to architectural and behavioral instability. Behavioral instability was not a phrase the church used lightly. Julian made inquiries. Most doors stayed closed. But a retired scribe in Toulouse quietly handed him something strange, a copy of a ledger, said to be the convent's internal death log. This ledger was never filed with the diocese. It was kept in private by the Mother Superior, and its contents were troubling. For every official entry marked as transferred, there was a corresponding private note beside it, written in a cramped, anxious hand: refused to eat after. Seventh night in room 12. Heard voices under the floor. Wrote the name again and again in chalk. Couldn't explain who it belonged to. Stared at the crucifix until her eyes bled. Said the room taught her a song she didn't remember learning. Gone. No sign of exit. Slippers still at the foot of the bed. These entries were never intended for outside eyes. They weren't even numbered like the rest of the convent's documentation. They were scrawled like warnings in the margins, confessions of someone terrified to admit what she was witnessing. Julian sought to visit the ruins himself. By then, the building was near collapse, and vines had devoured most of the futon. He made his way inside carefully, sketching the layout. Most of the rooms were empty shells. Plaster hung like scabs from the walls. Window frames wept rain. But room 12 was intact, perfectly intact. The bed still stood. The desk, too. Dust thick as velvet coated every surface. But strangely, the floor beneath the window was clean. Not swept, but untouched. Like no dust had ever landed there. And the strange part? The bones were gone. Julian had expected the ossuary pit to still be sealed beneath the floorboards. Instead, the boards had been removed and resealed with modern nails. Someone had already been here. Someone had already dug them up. He found no official record of any archaeological dig, no church-ordered excavation, no relics listed in any museum. 11 skeletons gone, undocumented. That same evening, as he sat writing notes in the ruins, Julian began to hear something. Not footsteps. Not rats. Something else. A rhythmic tapping, faint but deliberate. It came from the walls, not loud, not menacing, but steady. Like knuckles against wood. Or fingernails tapping to a pattern. He left before nightfall. His notes describe a rising sense of confusion as he tried to exit the building. The halls, he claimed, seemed longer than they had been before. Doorways were mismatched, and windows he had opened earlier were now shut and latched. When he returned to Toulouse, Julian presented his findings to a professor of theology. He was told gently to stop. Not because he was wrong, but because he was far too close. Over the following weeks, Julian began having dreams. Always the same. A nun kneeling in room 12, her veil soaked with something dark, her hands clasped in prayer over a small wooden box. In every dream, she turned toward him but had no face. Just a flat surface, as if a wax mask had melted smooth. In one dream, she opened her mouth. Inside was a circle of teeth facing inward. Julian abandoned his work. He never submitted his thesis, but he made one final note in the margin of his own copy of the ledger. This place was never cursed. It was built to contain something. We don't know what room 12 was meant to hold, but we know it failed at *. The removal of the bones suggests someone knew what was there and either wanted to study it or feared what would happen if they remained. And what of the names? Each vanished sister had left behind traces a name. Carved into wood, a stitch in a prayer cloth, a note hidden in a hymnal, but none were ever canonized. None were ever formally buried. Their identities erased, except one. In the diocesan vault of Avignon, a single document remains misfiled in the folder of convent closures. It's a death certificate dated 1872. The name, Sister Angelique Morel. The cause of death, vocal cessation. Body not recovered. In the margin, room 12. What is vocal cessation? Silence so absolute it becomes fatal. A vanishing of identity, of voice, of the self. And what did she mean when she wrote, in her final journal line, found scratched into the deskwood in room 12. It wants to learn how to pray. It wants to learn how to pray by the time the church officially sealed off Couvent Sainte Marguerite for good in 1971. Room 12 had already become a quiet obsession for a small circle of fringe theologians, occult historians, and archivists too curious for their own safety. What began as a peculiar pattern of unrecorded deaths had shifted, subtly, insidiously, into something far stranger. Among them was Dr. Elizabeth Juvet, a historian with a background in Christian mysticism. She wasn't a conspiracy theorist. Her early work focused on mundane liturgical shifts during the post-revolution period. But room 12 pulled at her, the way a loose thread on a cloak keeps catching your eye. She compiled every whisper, every journal, every field note she could find. One of her most disturbing discoveries came from a 1901 letter written by an elderly priest stationed in Moréville. In it, he described having once heard a confession from a nun who claimed her prayers were being repeated back to her, word for word, but before she spoke them. The voice, she said, sounded almost human. She fled the convent weeks later. Dr. Juvet's most shocking find, however, was a wax cylinder recording. It was unlabeled, discovered in a donation box left at the Municipal Library of Lyon in the 1980s. When she played it, after carefully restoring the brittle material, she expected music or oral history. Instead, what she heard was something else. A woman's voice reciting the Ave Maria. But not quite. The words drifted, as though recited by someone who had learned the structure of the prayer, but not the meaning. Pacing was wrong. Emphasis landed in unnatural places. Halfway through, the voice began to imitate a second voice, deeper, slower, echoing the same prayer but several beats ahead of the original. As if leading, as if teaching. Elizabeth's analysis concluded the voice was not that of a nun, but something imitating one. Something trying to sound devout, but incapable of nuance. Something practicing. Later audio analysis suggested a secondary frequency layered into the recording just beneath human hearing. A droning harmonic, unnatural, possibly artificially induced, but the equipment was analog. There was no technology in 1901 that could have produced such layering. So where had the recording come from? Why was it anonymously submitted? And why did one of Elizabeth's colleagues who listened to the full playback reportedly lose the ability to speak for nearly 2 weeks? Asterisk by 1992. Rumors surfaced that room 12 had been bricked over by local officials at the church's quiet request. Not demolished, not cleansed. Simply sealed shut, as if the space itself could be ignored into irrelevance. Asterisk. But some things cannot be buried that easily. Asterisk. During a restoration of a nearby vineyard cellar in 2003, workers unearthed a collapsed tunnel that connected directly to the foundation of the convent. Within it, partially preserved by the cool, dry air, were scraps of parchment, bone fragments, and a single clay rosary, melted together at the chain. On one of the scraps was an unfamiliar phrase in Latin, dicit orare. It is learning to pray. The church has no comment on room 12 today. Official records list the convent as decommissioned due to regional instability and architectural rot. But no one who lives in Moraville believes that anymore. Asterisk. Elder. Villagers still remember the sisters who left in silence. One recalls, as a child, seeing a nun on the hill outside the ruins, her veil blown back by the wind revealing not a face but a smooth, pale surface, unbroken, with no features at all. He told no one for 40 years, and then only in a whisper. Asterisk. So, what was room 12? Some say it was a thin place, a weak spot between something sacred and something far older. Others believe it was a trap. Not for evil, not for demons, but for something curious. Something that wanted to understand faith. Not destroy it, but wear it. Speak it. Learn it. Asterisk. And perhaps, once it learns the prayers by heart, it will no longer need to remain in one room. Perhaps it will build a church of its own, and the next time you kneel and begin to whisper your deepest confession, how sure are you, really, that the voice inside your mind is still your own?